Hello, everyone. Welcome to Let's Talk About Brand. I, of course, am your host, Christine Gritmon. I do the show every Friday at 12 noon Eastern Time. And if I sound a little bit funny, it's because this is the second week in a row that I'm actually broadcasting not from my home studio. Last week, I was where was I even last week? Last week, I was going away on my husband's work retreat, and today I'm on a work retreat for me. But I got my setup here, we're all good, and I got my guest. I've got a great guest today. But before I get to that, I want to point out that Mercury is in retrograde. Any of you who showed up for my Tuesday Twitter chat about brand, saw that Twitter for desktop essentially shut down at the exact moment that the chat started. But we still had an incredible discussion about branding and internal culture, which is what we're going to be talking about today. Again, that is my Tuesday Twitter chat about brand, which happens Tuesdays at 12 noon, only on Twitter. And we always discuss the same topic as I'm going to discuss with my Friday live stream guest. Please let us know if you are here watching us live, and if so, which platform, because we are live right now on Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, YouTube, and in theory, Amazon Live, though I haven't been able to get that one working. We'll see how that goes. So let us know if you're here live or on the replay and what platform you're joining us on. Speaking of platforms, I now have a Patreon platform so that I can help my group of patrons learn a little bit more from each week's lesson about how they can apply it to their own personal brands. And you're going to see their names in the credits at the end. Let's see if I can get them all. All right, we've got Emma Pirchu, Bonnie Wilson, Amanda Hahn-Peters, Maiko Sakai, Suzanne, okay, Susie, consulting, and we now just have Natalie Gregg. Yes, I got them all. Thank you so much. You guys help out so much with keeping this all going, and I love your commitment to building your own personal brands. All right, so without any further ado, we are here to talk to our guest. Our guest is Galen Emanuele. Maybe it's Emanuele. I'm so sorry. Should have checked that. I'm totes profesh, you guys. Galen is a company culture specialist. He works with teams, he works with leadership, he works with EQ, emotional intelligence, and his whole thing is about how organizations can support their people better, support their culture better, which ultimately benefits the whole darn company. And he's here today to talk about internal branding and how your company needs to walk the talk internally amidst its own employees in addition to externally. And I encourage anyone who has any questions on that topic to chime right in the comments. All right, without any further ado, let us bring Galen on. Yay!
Hello.
Hello. So we had a Mercury retrograde moment just a minute ago. We could not get that input working until literally 12 noon on the dot. But, you know, things work out. That's what matters, right?
Yes. Yeah. And so excited to be here. Hello, Christine.
Hello. So we had a little chat yesterday, just one-on-one, but I'd love it if you could kind of quickly tell everyone who wasn't there on the phone with us how you got into doing what you do and how you describe doing what you do, because it's pretty unique.
Yeah, so I got pretty organically got into doing this work. I've always had a sort of like sales and marketing background. I've always been an entrepreneur, just in my bones. And I started taking improv, like Whose Line Is It Anyway, kind of like improv theater classes a long time ago. And when at one point, after teaching and performing improv for years and years and years, I became the marketing and sales director for the improv theater that I was performing and teaching at, and I just saw a ton of opportunity for basically a crossover between, you know, the skills of improv and how improv works, and sort of how that applies to teams, leaders, communication, interpersonal, sort of like just behavior. So I started putting on classes and workshops and developing curriculum and seeing what worked and what didn't. And before pretty long, I just kind of like took off. I was working with bigger companies, Microsoft. So within a couple of years, I was like, this is the only thing I ever want to do. I left, started my own company, and that was 8 years ago now. So it was, and then that's just evolved from doing kind of skills training into like working with teams around like really developing culture internally. So so it's just it's been a really fun, amazing journey, and that's kind of how I got into this.
I love that. So, how does improv relate to business culture?
Well, improv is, I mean, in terms, people think that improv is being funny, being on stage, acting, doing weird things. The truth is, like, behind the scenes, how the sausage is made when it comes to improv, it's really, there's kind of like five main tenets of improv is all based around this core idea of yes and, of accepting offers and ideas and adding on to them and just building together. And so there are kind of five main tenets of improv around, like, say yes, listen and be present, make other people look good, embrace change and failure, be positive. So there's a lot of like behavior kind of skills that make improv successful, that are also like a ton of parallels between how teams can be more successful, how people can communicate better, sort of cultivate creativity and just intentional behavior around how we respond to other people's ideas, or just communicate with them. So yeah, so it's just there's a lot of parallels there that are really that are really beneficial, and I think people, that's part of one of the fun things about one aspect of what I do is with that skills training, is sort of bridging those gaps, right? People don't think of improv in terms of helping how they lead teams or how they communicate and show up at work, or do anything that they do, interacting with other human beings. But there's a lot there, and it's really fun. So
That is definitely true. I actually have professional improv training that I got like 20 years ago. A lot of people don't know that about me. So I understand about how all of that relates to people contributing to corporate culture and making sure that they have that yes and behavior where they're building each other up, they're making each other look good. But here's the question. The thing everyone knows about improv is that it's unscripted. You maybe receive sort of a basic scenario, but much like life itself, you have to act and think on your feet to some level. Now we're talking about brand. Branding is generally a bit more codified. It's sort of lanes you have to stay in to a degree. And I understand how a lot of that cultural contribution stuff might relate to how employees can contribute to their corporate culture. I'd like to talk about sort of a top-down view, and how brand culture that we express externally as part of the brand, especially things like consumer brands, how we can make sure that that trickles down internally, because I'm sure you've seen situations where it has not, and that is not ideal. So tell us a little bit about sort of how that can work, how following the sort of script of a brand can contribute to that type of environment.
yeah, that's a great kind of question. And I, in the work that I do with teams around building culture and developing culture, it is, when I think of culture in terms just defining culture, I say that is sort of like, it's basically the rules of engagement of how people show up and approach their work and treat other people on the team. So when we talk about culture, it's sort of like, what is the environment? What does it feel like to be there? And so to create an exceptional culture internally, you have to have a clearly defined code of conduct that outlines, these are the behaviors of what it means to be here and how we show up together, that just clearly defined, that are universally understood, that everybody takes kind of ownership for and accountability for, that nobody is exempt from. So to create an exceptional culture, you have to have that first piece, is a really clearly defined kind of culture. And I know that the way that most organizations approach culture is kind of the 1.0, what people understand to do, which is create a mission statement and a vision statement and a list of values, usually some version of trust, integrity, respect, teamwork, excellence, fun, and be like, that's our culture. And I sort of refer to that as kind of like being a values-based culture. And also that is not incredibly effective, kind of with what you said earlier, Christine, is that companies that have those values, people gossip, there's silos between departments, there is, it's sort of like anything but in terms of respect or excellence, right? Where leaders don't ask for feedback, or there's just a lot of challenges. And so I think what the missing piece is when we talk about defining culture just in general is that we have to be clear and create kind of a behavior-based culture. So instead of saying excellence, we have to define what that looks like in practice and what that looks like in action. So to our organization. So for me, excellence might mean that we ask for feedback on a regular basis, and also that we receive and give feedback with grace, right? That we see feedback as an opportunity to improve, not as a threat, and build better relationships. And we actively like seek it out on a regular basis as a tool to improve. That to me is a version of like excellence. That's one example of what excellence looks like in practice. And so to build cultures or talk about cultures, if it's not behavior based, if 10 people couldn't read it and think exactly the same thing and understand it in exactly the same way, it's not clear enough. So respect, for example, trust, it's like, what does that mean to 10 or 400 or 4,000 different employees? So when we develop a culture that is based in behaviors that are really concrete, that says, we don't badmouth or gossip about other people. If you have a problem with someone, you go right to the source. Or, just how we talk about conflict, feedback, change management, diversity and inclusion, but in behaviors. And so I think, the question is for like, how do you live that internally? It has to be clear. And that is a missing piece for most organizations, is that they don't have a clear sort of behavior-based culture. They use broad, kind of loosely defined concepts to say this is our culture, but it doesn't translate on the ground, right? And I think that's a challenge for organizations.
Disruptors. Yeah, absolutely. Now, you mentioned the code of conduct and how a lot of workplaces ideally have that, and they all probably look pretty similar. I'd like to talk about how it connects to the external brand. Previously, I feel like a lot of brands sort of tried to keep it generic so they could appeal to more people, but we've seen a huge shift in industry, in marketing, in branding, where now brands actually do stand for something. They are more values based because consumers are responding to that. Consumers feel a lot more aligned with brands that align with the values that they personally hold.
Right.
But of course, we all hear stories about brands that put themselves forth as one thing and are actually another. We talked yesterday about how in my 20s, I worked for a brand that was all about, nature and healing and the holistic person. And they brought in massage therapists and Reiki therapists. And it was such a toxic workplace that so many people left. And no matter how many free massages you give, the fact is they were not living their values. I landed in the hospital with stress-induced acid reflux at 23. I got Reiki at work once, nice healing. And I had to leave work early because I couldn't stop crying because it unlocked all the toxicity. Places where they say that they empower and champion women because women are their ideal customer avatar. And then you look at the leadership and they're all male and you hear about stories. So I'd love to talk a little bit and hear from you about sort of how those external brand values, where some places go wrong in embracing them internally and how they can ensure that they go right.
Right. And I think what you're kind of talking about to me is around commitment, right? And accountability, where if we say, this is how we show up, this is how we treat each other, this is what we mean, this is what we believe in, and this is like how we want to present ourselves, and this is kind of, that first, I talked about kind of the first piece of defining culture, which is clarity, right? Which is to be very clear about behaviors. This is what it means to be here. This is how we treat each other. The second very important element that has to be in place to have culture that's successful, that's consistent, is commitment. You have to be accountable to it across the board. And this really has to start at the highest level of leadership inside the organization to say, these are our values. This is these are the ground rules and the code of conduct for us. We're 100% committed to this, which means that the CEO to a frontline employee, someone that's been there for 20 years or who has a very important job, that nobody is exempt, that every single person is sort of held accountable to that same standard. And when I talk about accountability, right, it's not about punishment. It's not about threatening people's jobs. It's just about saying we're 100% committed to this. So anything that happens here out of alignment with this culture and these behaviors will not be allowed. And everybody has to universally understand, and we have to walk the talk as an organization and as a leadership team, that if somebody were to repeatedly show up out of alignment with our sort of code of conduct and our culture and our behaviors, we are committed to removing that person from the organization, right? And another element of that is kind of who holds the cards to hold each other accountable. Can employees speak truth to power? Do leaders ask for feedback? Are we evaluating, right? Are we asking for feedback as an organization and as leaders from our people to say, are we really living these values or behaviors, right? And addressing immediately when we're not, and making sure that we are 100% committed to this is how we are and nothing else is allowed, right? Because the truth about that too in organizations and leadership is whatever you allow, you endorse. Whatever you allow to take place without addressing or changing, like you are basically putting a stamp on that and saying like, yep, we approve of this. This is okay. As long as you have a high enough title, you've been here long enough, et cetera. And the way that you avoid what you experienced and that sort of inconsistency is to, as a leadership team, say, we are 100% committed to this. People will lose their jobs. Like this is something you can lose your job for if you're not showing up in alignment with these values. And we mean it across the board, no exemptions at all. And all of us hold the cards in terms of having the ability and empowering employees and empowering everyone in the organization to say, hey, that thing that's happening right there, that behavior, this dynamic, this is completely out of line. And to do something about that and to care. And that is how you sort of address and counteract what you're talking about, which is rampant in organizations. Is you've got leaders who yell at people in meetings and embarrass them and do all kinds of gossip. Like things are allowed, and when you allow something, you're basically saying this other thing that we said we believed is not true. So that it just becomes that like any conversations around culture is just internal marketing, not actually us living what we say we believe. It's designed to make employees feel better and keep lower level employees in line, but it's garbage. And that is something that employees can smell and feel and sense. And it's the same thing that you experienced. It's like, hey, we say we're this thing. It's very toxic here. So
what are some creative ways that you've seen brands walk the talk of their external values, if it's something specific? Like, for example, I've heard that Patagonia, which is an outdoors brand, I've heard that they really encourage their people to take time off and go have adventures. Like a company like Chewy, maybe they allow people to bring their pets to work. How have you seen brands sort of allow the brand itself to suffuse the whole internal environment? Have you seen any of that kind of in companies you work for, or even just, things you've heard of anecdotally?
Yeah, I mean, I think I've seen, now I'm struggling to think of like a very concrete, specific example of that, but I think companies that, there are companies that do that really, really well, that sort of incorporate, this is what we do. And this is, I think with organizations that do a lot of kind of like volunteering or that also contribute to the things that they say are important, right? So, like you said, a brand that is like, hey, we are about empowering women and supporting women, but then they also do work that is very specifically like contributing to, women-owned businesses or, different ways that sort of like that make that real. So I'm trying to think of like a very concrete, specific example. I'm trying to think of like,
It's okay. I sort of sprung this one on you. It is all good. We have some questions from the Tuesday Twitter chat for you, chat about brand. And just a reminder that anyone who wants to join the chat on Tuesdays, you will have an opportunity to pose a question for our Friday guest. And people watching in the comments right now, lay it on me. So first off, Marion, who is watching us on LinkedIn right now, she said, what is the best way to convey culture to line workers in the field, not the corporate office? So people who are a bit more removed from that corporate environment. How do you communicate the internal brand there?
Yep. Love it. I love that question. And it goes back to kind of what I was talking about in terms of clarity, because when I think of that question of like, how do you relate that culture to frontline employees or people that are on the field? My question is always, how clear is it? How clear do you talk about it? How clearly defined is it? That's really important, because it's like, how do we convey this to them? And is it crystal clear? And to me, also, again, not values, not sort of like loose concepts of like trust or friendliness, but to really kind of break that down into behaviors and get clear to say, this is our sort of DNA code in terms of what is acceptable here. So step one is make sure it's really, really, really clear. And then step number two, in terms of how do you convey that, is this is another really important element of culture. So I talked about like clarity, commitment being the second piece. The third one is sort of consistency, and that is integrating and implementing your culture and these behaviors into the entire employee experience. So instead of just having a meeting where we talk about it once, it should be part of your hiring process, onboarding, training and development, right? Coaching and feedback, performance evaluations, rewards and recognitions. It's like we take this DNA code, this sort of culture code for us that we've created that are behavior-based kind of like outline of our culture, and we integrate that into kind of the entire employee experience. So it's not like, how do I one time convey this to these people that are down here? It's like they're, if they're having a monthly team meeting, for example, like they're talking about those behaviors. That's a perfect example. My company does this, and teams I work with sort of encourage this, is that like once a month you meet with your whole team, your whole direct team. Everybody reads through their sort of code of conduct, or their, the culture that you have in place in terms of those behaviors, and then have an opportunity as a team to talk about this. Like, are we living this? And I think, on my team, what happens is each person individually shares of our sort of DNA code. This is something I'm doing great. This is something I know is an area of opportunity for me. And then we give kudos to each other for like things specifically from that sort of DNA code. So again, like a monthly team meeting is a way to sort of reinforce that language and create consistency in the organization, and to be consistent, right, on a regular basis. Our culture shouldn't be something we talk about once every 6 months, once every year at an all hands meeting. It has to be integrated and part of the entire employee experience. And so thinking about how you can do that as a team, how can we integrate this into team meetings, feedback, recognition, coaching, right, all those things, so that that is the anchor of what employees experience here, so that it's consistent.
And I love what you said about hiring for it from the get-go, because when it comes down to it, people make the culture. No matter how many lists or handbooks you put together, the people make the culture. So hiring for the right people is just so key, and that constant communication. I have a similar question to the previous one from Jennifer L. Dawson, JLD Content Queen. And she wants to know, how can companies who have made the move from on-site to remote translate their culture to workers when there are no more physical team gatherings, in-person brainstorms, and the office is no longer the company home? So how do you really help them feel connected to those values when you're not in a position to even enforce them in the usual ways?
That's a great question. And to me, the answer is almost exactly parallel to the last one, which is, how do we maintain that culture when we're not in person? And I would say, looking at that organization or any organization, to be like, how clearly defined is your culture at all? Because when we have something that says, this is how we treat each other, this is how we show up and do our work, this is how we address, critical topics, conflict, feedback, change management, right? Like caliber of work and like performance, right? Like accountability and commitment in terms of like, if I say I'm going to do something, I do it on time, right? They're like, we take ownership for our own mistakes, et cetera. When we have a really extremely clear culture, it doesn't matter if we're operating over a video call, we're hybrid, people are in the office, some people aren't. It makes no difference. As long as I'm contributing to this organization and this team, these are the ground rules that are expected of every person. So I think it's really important to say, and a lot of that question comes up a lot, and I'm always like, do you have a clearly defined culture in behaviors? Because if you don't, it's harder to maintain that culture when people are remote. But regardless of their circumstance, regardless of where they're working or how they're working together, when you have it clearly defined, that is what we're holding people accountable to. And then we're also looking for ways that, like if part of those behaviors that we make people feel listened to and we empower people's voices to speak up, then we're thinking about our processes as we create new processes, like we've got hybrid meetings, et cetera. We take a look at that and say, how are we doing that in these scenarios? So if we have new working scenarios or new situations for us, we're taking a look at those situations and saying, how do we live these behaviors in these scenarios? And having those meaningful conversations to be like, how do we make sure that people feel listened to, empowered, et cetera? Maybe there's, town halls with leadership so that you can, have more communication, but it's redefining how do we communicate, how do we interact, but based on these very, very, very clearly defined culture behaviors. And when we have that in place, people know what they're getting into. They understand how to act, how to approach their work, right? What caliber of work, paying attention to detail, all of those types of things that sort of inform us. What does it mean to be here? And that is the strongest, best way. So that as we look at hybrid working, et cetera, we are like, are we even clear about what our culture is and what that means here? Because when we are, then it's like, great, how do we translate this to people? How do we live this every day? How do we live it in these scenarios that are new scenarios for us? But universally these same concepts, these same behaviors are sort of in play.
Absolutely. And it's a matter of just getting people to feel that they're part of something. Because of course you're not going to get the best out of somebody like they're a silo, an island unto themselves. I have a quick question kind of along those lines. You mentioned a lot of what you've talked about is sort of the codified conduct, behavior, and sort of as it relates to business processes and things like that. A lot of companies, of course, we all hear about Google and Facebook and all the ping pong tables and all that stuff. I'd love to hear just a little bit about how you've seen companies infuse culture into their non-business activities in that kind of way.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's it's a great question. I'm trying to think of like specific examples for that. How companies infuse culture into like non-business things. I think it's just, what I've seen is that when organizations have culture that's very clearly defined, that they're committed to, right, that's consistent, is that you just see people embody those things. That people sort of just act and become right, like show up in that way around that culture because that's sort of what's expected. So I mean, yeah. I can't think of meaningful examples. Something of like company picnics and like outings and things like that where people are just participating.
Yeah.
But I mean, and I think it's a lot of kind of like what we talked about before, the idea of kind of like volunteering and saying, how do we as an organization, not just as individual people, but how do we as an organization support the things that we say that we care about, and what do we do? And I think it's just like when all of those things are integrated and together, then then you have the opportunity for companies to like do creative things, to live their mission values and like their brand, right? Both like with internal processes and just like what they do, right? What organizations, like how they speak out against like social issues or whatever. Yeah.
I love that. All right. So, last chance if anyone wants to get some questions in. But Galen, in the meantime, tell people where they can find you and why they should.
Okay, great. So my website is galenemanuele.com. I'm on all the regular social media platforms, so Instagram, Twitter, of course, LinkedIn. I'm all of those places. @ShiftYes is the handle for most of for kind of social media stuff. Every week I put out a 5-minute video that is called the Culture Drop, and that all those videos go on YouTube too. So my YouTube channel has a ton of quick 5-minute videos that are all around like very specific kind of aspects, elements of building culture, teams, emotional intelligence, hiring, firing, giving and receiving feedback, navigating conflict. There's a lot of just sort of like skills-based thing that are in there. So if people are interested, that's something, it's free, it's not spammy, there's no like paid version of it. It literally is one email a week every Tuesday morning with like a 5-minute video in it. That's all it is. So that is something, the Culture Drop is, you can sign up for that on my website as well. But yeah, so like I have a lot of content out there. So connecting on LinkedIn or anywhere, a lot of that content I post also on social channels and LinkedIn. So people can find me and connect. And I do, training with teams and also work with like executive leadership teams to develop culture, talk about culture, have meaningful like conversations and take action around like how do you establish and develop a very intentional culture inside the organization. So any and all topics in that space. Love to connect with people.
Love that. And I will point out that I'm on your email list, and your videos and your content is how I found you. I was seeing it on Instagram and everything was just so relatable, so digestible. Your emails and your weekly videos are also, it's great because you take a potentially complicated concept or, a simple element of a concept, and you just present it in such a clear way that people can relate to and understand. So thank you for your content. Everyone should check that out. And thank you for being here today.
Yes, thanks, Christine. I love it. I love these conversations. I think it's so, it's just so important how employees connect to organizations. And part of that is like, what does it feel like to be here? And that experience, to prioritize that, to focus on that. It's like, it's so important, especially right now with retention and attracting talent. And I mean, it's so important that brands care about the employee experience and be like, how do we live these things in practice? How do we make it feel exceptional here? And where there was this focus of being customer obsessed, and for a long time, it's how companies were winning and innovating in that space. It's like to be obsessed about employee experience is
Yeah.
very important. It's like, what does it feel like to be here? How do we treat people? What are our leaders like? Are we training them? Do we have great leadership here? Like those types of things, I think, to be obsessed with employee experience, because employees, like customers, can go somewhere else, right? So, yeah.
And they can damage your brand. And your brand is ultimately how you make people feel. It's the impression you leave on people. Well, thank
Yeah.
you so much for being here today, Galen. This was fantastic. I appreciate your insights so much.
Awesome. Thanks, Christine. You're awesome.
Person. Whoops. There I am. Hi. So, again, thank you everyone for joining us today. I do the show every single Friday at 12 noon Eastern. Next week's show is actually not live. Next week, I'm interviewing someone from Australia. So, rather than having her get up at 3 a.m., we decided to just pre record. We haven't done it yet. I like doing it as close to the show as possible. So, next week's guest is going to be the fabulous Anna McAfee. And Anna, a lot of you have experienced her work without knowing her. She was the co-founder of LinkedIn Local. I myself am a LinkedIn Local co-host. Whoops. I myself am a LinkedIn Local co-host. I actually got involved back when Anna was running it, and I interviewed with someone from her team just to make sure that I was on brand and understood what it was all about. She went on to found Local X, and which is very similar in concept. It's a matter of taking the online relationships offline in our local areas, and we're going to be talking about branding a community. And very similar to branding an internal culture, honestly, but branding a community. And of course, as every week, the Tuesday Twitter chat is on that same topic. So we're going to be on Twitter on Tuesday talking about branding a community. And I absolutely welcome your thoughts. I hope you will tune in. And thank you again to everyone viewing. Thank you again to our replay viewers. Let us know where you're watching. Feel free to reach out to me anytime. And thank you also to my fabulous patrons who you're about to see in a minute. Thanks very much. Bye.